Hello friends, I am GM Danielson. Welcome to the channel. I am so pleased to present this set of stories for you. Happy autumn! I hope your season is going well. In fact, I hope listening to my videos, especially these contained within this video, makes your autumnal season a bit chillier, a bit crisper, a bit spicier, and perhaps most important of all, a bit spookier. So sit back, friends, grab your favorite pumpkin spice or damn pumpkin spice, and grab your favorite whiskey, coffee, or other autumnal drink. Curl up beside the fire if you need it. Close your eyes. We don't recommend that, or do we? And listen to me tell you these scary pumpkin stories. Jack-o'-lantern by S.E. Schlosser. After a long day of unlucky hunting, I found myself stuck in the middle of the marshlands for the night, without a flashlight or a lantern to guide my stumbling steps. So I settled beside a fallen log to rest until daylight. As I tossed and turned, I recalled the story my great-uncle told me about a ghost that haunted the marshlands. There was once a man named Jack who was a nasty fellow. He beat his wife and kids and was an all-around bad chap. Jack got worse and worse as the years rolled by, but Jack's body finally got so wore out that he died. He went up to heaven, but St. Peter refused to let such a wretched fellow in. Then he went to hell, but the devil barred the door as soon as he saw Jack coming and wouldn't let him in either. "Go away and don't come back," the devil told Jack. "How am I supposed to get back in the dark?" Jack grumbled. "Give me a lantern." So the devil threw a chunk of molten fire out to Jack, who took it up for his lantern and went back to Earth, where he wanders forever through the swamps and marshlands, a bitter spirit whose only delight was in luring the unwary to their doom with his lamp. At this juncture in my musings, I happened to look out over the marshlands and noticed a blinking light in the fog. "Is that you, Jack-o'-lantern?" I called jovially. "Jack, Jack, Jack," a voice whispered back. I was seriously spooked. I clutched my gun to my chest, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Had that been an echo of my voice, or was someone out here with me? "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave and menacing. I waved my gun around, though it was unlikely anyone or anything could see it in the dark. "Show yourself at once!" "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed from a completely different section of the swamp. The light blinked on and then off, on and then off. Shudders ran up my spine at the sound of that ghastly voice coming from nowhere. I huddled up against the log, wanting something firm at my back. Suddenly the story of the jack-o'-lantern didn't seem so funny. My heart was pounding so hard it made my chest hurt. I strained my ears in the silence that fell over the swamp. "Jack, Jack, Jack." The voice hissed from somewhere to my left this time. The light blinked on, off, on. I counted 10 heartbeats this time before it went off. The voice sounded closer. I held very still, my instincts screaming at me to hold my breath and not move until the menace had passed. The voice came again, far off to the right. "Jack, Jack, Jack," it hissed. The light came on, off, on, off. It's moving away, I thought, relaxing a bit. Feeling safer, there was a long, long, long silence. Nothing stirred, not the wind in the grass, nor the frogs or turtles in the water, not the crickets, nor the insects. "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed softly, right into my ear, and I looked up into the glowing red eyes and twisted face of the jack-o'-lantern. I screamed and lashed out at it with my gun. I ran a few steps, tripped and fell over, knocking my head on a sharp stone. For a moment I saw stars and felt blood pouring from my scalp, but the jack-o'-lantern was right behind me. I had to get away. I rolled and fell into a deep pool. I plunged under the water, flailing desperately against rope-like grasses that tried to keep me down. My head finally burst out of the water, and I gasped desperately for air, treading water as best I could with my trembling limbs and aching head. I heard the creature laugh in the mist. "Jack, Jack, Jack," the voice hissed delightedly, and the light blinked on, off, on, right over my head, blinding my dazed eyes, as horror flowed through me and froze my limbs so I could no longer swim. For a long moment, the grotesque face and red eyes of the jack-o'-lantern loomed out of the mist before my petrified gaze. My head started to swim with pain from my bleeding skull. The evil face above me, lit by its bright light, whirled around and around, growing dimmer as my eyes started to glaze. I was vaguely aware that I should keep swimming, keep trying to make my way to the edge of the pool, but the effort was too much for my suddenly heavy limbs. I barely noticed myself plunging down and down into the watery depths of the pool, too stunned by my injury to fight my way to the surface a second time. Then there was only darkness and silence, and a voice hissing in cold triumph. "Jack, Jack, Jack." Pumpkin shoes by polonium poisoning. A few years ago, I stopped at a pumpkin farm by the road. What sparked my interest was that they claimed to have the most unique, scary pumpkins in the country. The carvings were perfect, delicately made but still strongly scary. Every single pumpkin had received a face different from the others, a face that conveyed such horror that it's no exaggeration to say I felt my legs tremble just from looking at them. They weren't simple jack-o'-lanterns. They looked truly human. A teenage girl in overalls poked my arm. She introduced herself as a farm worker and asked if I knew the true story of this place. I didn't. So she told me. Over 400 years ago, this area was a small village. One day, a child was born different. You see, her feet were made of pumpkin. The village was struggling with hunger, as it was common around these parts at this time, so the parents saw it as a blessing. Maybe God is trying to tell us something. Maybe these little feet will help us cultivate the land. The couple had 5 other children, but all of them had normal feet. As their pumpkin-footed daughter grew up, they started telling people that the girl was wearing pumpkins as her shoes, something bizarre but not enough to be considered witchcraft, they thought. When she was 5, they found out that simply having the girl walk the soil for 2 hours was enough to make full-fledged pumpkins grow from the ground. Thanks to her, soon there would be no more famine in the village. But, afraid that her odd power would be her demise, her parents were very secretive about it. They sent their older children to leave pumpkins by other people's doorsteps in the middle of the night. The child got older, and with that, her power became more efficient and extant. At 12, she only needed to walk the soil for 45 minutes to bring pumpkins into existence. It was when little Miss Pumpkin Shoes turned 15 that things changed. Despite never leaving the farm and having a reputation of being odd, she started getting multiple proposals. All the while, her older sisters got none. So with the help of the brothers, who also resented her for being their parents' odd favorite, the siblings started plotting. They got themselves a good fortune, which included marrying all the sisters to the most influential families in the village. Then, they told everyone the truth about their sisters' feet. The people in the village were disgusted. All this time they had eaten the pumpkins of a witch, demonic pumpkins. They immediately gathered together and headed to her house. Nearly the whole village was emptied. Her parents were mercilessly killed by the very neighbors with which they had shared their pumpkins. With no will to fight after seeing such a gruesome scene, Miss Pumpkin Shoes let herself be led to whatever horrible destiny was hers. Some of the villagers carried her off in chains like the worst criminal, while others burned down her house. That's when she saw the look on her siblings' faces, the look of guilt, that bittersweet look between accomplishing what you wanted and despairing that it wasn't how it was meant to be. At that moment, her whole body started brimming with the mysterious force that came from her pumpkin feet. She just walked. Just walked. But her power had other plans. Her power started growing vines so aggressively that in a matter of seconds all her tormentors had their legs stuck and couldn't break free. She just walked, but soon the vines were covering the whole ground, then the whole village. She just walked, but her feet were frantically, uncontrollably giving life to dozens, then hundreds of pumpkins at once. She just walked, but she trampled those who had robbed her of her peace and of her loving parents. The vine tendrils entered their bodies through all orifices, eyes and nose and mouth, and you know what else. Giving life to giant, perfectly developed pumpkins that were born in their entrails and exploded their bodies from the inside. And each of those pumpkins, surrounded by entrails and body parts, had a face, a unique face, the face of horror belonging to the witch hunter who had incubated it. That's what we try to reproduce here. Go ahead, see it for yourself. The teenager smiled, satisfied with herself. Her storytelling was indeed fantastic. I lightly touched one of the pumpkins. It was no carving. The pumpkin had actually been born with a face. "Pretty realistic, huh?" she remarked. I laughed nervously. "What happened to Pumpkin Shoes after that?" I asked. They said she moved to a faraway place where she could be alone and unbothered, and that she even learned to control her power after that." "That's awesome, I guess," I replied. She grinned. "But some say she's still out there. That's why the pumpkins still grow like this, with actual faces." I took a good look at my pal for the first time. Her overalls ended in pumpkin shoes. Today I passed by the farm again, and the same girl in overalls waved to me. She hadn't aged a single day since 2014. Timmy Liked Jack-o'-lanterns by Zodiac Brave. I have to be completely honest. I don't remember how I both forgot about or remembered this moment in my life. I was pretty young, but I have a decent memory of the majority of things that took place in the era of being 10 or 11. Learned how to ride a bike, getting my first dog, you know, the simple stuff. What we can repress is always fascinating to me. That's what's weird, though. I remember it all now. The signs, the questions, the fearful look in my mother and father's eyes when they found out. But through all of that, I can't remember suppressing the memory. It makes absolute sense as to why I would have, all things considered, but I just can't seem to figure out where I blocked it out. I suppose it really isn't important, just something that caught my attention. What is fresh in my mind, however, is having to bring the topic up to my mother 20 years after it all happened, forcing her to relive those days with me in order to piece things together again. When the memory flickered into my mind again, she was the only person I could think to ask. I felt a lot of guilt having her dive into that rabbit hole with me. Her kind eyes darkened the moment I brought it up, as if watching someone gain years on the spot. Lord knows she didn't need my help with that. It was 5th grade. Bodily changes, emotional turmoil, and an all-around rough time to be a kid. On top of that, I knew a bunch of kids who weren't as lucky as me in the home area. Garrett was extremely poor, but he was happy and he managed it well, extremely kind for his lot in life. Kirsten lost her dad the year before. You could easily tell she was changing due to it, acting out and letting grades slip. It was sad, but she got better in later years. And then there was Timothy. Timothy's family was Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, some sort of deeply maniacal religion. I noticed it pretty early on in the year. It started with me discussing a video game mechanic regarding resurrection with another student. Timothy turned and looked at me with borderline hatred in his eyes. "You can't do that. Only God can do that," he muttered angrily under his breath. We rolled our eyes. Timothy had made it very clear very quickly that Harry Potter and Final Fantasy and any other fantastical things we kids liked were defined as witchcraft. "It's a game, Timothy," my friend Logan spoke back to him, scoffing a bit. "It's blasphemy," Timothy stated sternly, his eyes turning back to our math assignment. "God doesn't like to be mocked." This was an 11-year-old boy. Please remember that. But who talks like that at that age? In my opinion, only the brainwashed talk like that. I apologize if I offended anyone's faith, but that's fucking insane. No child should be worried about what's mocking God. We didn't even know what to say to him. We just went back to our assignment and moved on. As that day progressed, I thought we'd got past that horrible notion. Timothy had ended up lightening up through the day and even laughing with us during group reading and our teacher's lame jokes. Me and Logan and the others, put off by Timmy's behavior, just kind of let it go. We weren't the drama-loving type. We wanted everyone to get along, and so we were happy for it to be over. But it wasn't over. That night, me and my mom and dad went over to one of their friends for dinner. Can't recall what we had, but I always loved their friends' cooking. What mattered was that during the dinner, my mom received a phone call. She excused herself and took the call, thinking it might be urgent. The days before being constant robocalled, am I right? She was gone about 5 minutes before I heard the conversation get heated. I could hear her almost yelling at whoever was on the phone from outside. I couldn't hear her words though, and my dad started asking me questions about school to keep me from getting upset. When she eventually came back, she didn't act as if anything was wrong and went about dinner normally. I tried to mimic that behavior, but there was so much I wanted to know, and it was nagging at me. I didn't like seeing my mom in distress like that. The night went well enough otherwise, and we left around an hour later. In the car, Mom looked at me from the passenger seat while my dad started the engine. "Did you do something to your classmate, Timothy?" My mom asked me sternly, receiving a glance from my father as she did. I was taken aback. I never bothered anyone. I didn't even cause any issues in class since I'd switched schools. "No, I didn't do anything to him. He just got randomly mad at me." I didn't think the details would be important at the moment. I just wasn't about to get in trouble for something I'd certainly not done. My mom sighed, turning back to face the dewy droplets of rain that had begun caressing the windshield. "I know," she started. "I figured that was the case." Her tone pirouetted from stern to seemingly depressed. She then went on to explain that it was Timothy's mother who had called her. Thinking about it now, I don't know how the hell she acquired my mom's phone number, but regardless, the conversation was apparently hostile from the start. Timothy's mom, sounding holier than thou, told my mom that I was practicing devil worship with the other students in my class. She berated my mother for being a lax and godless parent who allowed for demons to enter her son. Of course, my mom didn't take that too well. She yelled back and told her to watch how she spoke about her child and to never call her again. I'm sure more profanity was used in the altercation. What my mom told me recently was something about that call she refused to tell me when I was still so young. She said she could hear something like whipping in the background of that phone call, as well as Timothy's father yelling something about the lines of, "O Father that art in heaven." I didn't like to think about that part, as my imagination leaned toward the worst things I could think of. I hate that I was probably right, but I distinctly remember that next day. Timothy came to school with 0 sleep and was sort of slouching. I noticed all day that when he was in the chair, he wouldn't lean back all the way in it. He just sat in a hunch over his desk, avoiding pressing his back to the plastic back of the school seat. Realizing now what that means, really, it just made me so fucking angry and so fucking sad. That day was a Friday, and Timothy didn't say a word all day. If I knew then what I know now, maybe I would have reached out to him. That isn't how it went, though. Timothy sat alone in class, stewing in his thoughts. No one approached him, even though the teacher did look concerned pretty much all day. On the weekends, I always took to riding my bike through mine and nearby neighborhoods. As long as the weather was good, I was out there zooming around. By nearby, I mean maybe a dozen or so blocks away. So long as I avoided the overpasses or places like downtown, I was pretty much allowed to wander as I pleased. Timothy's house was in one of these said nearby neighborhoods. I saw Timothy sitting on his porch, looking a bit ragged, a dirty button-up tucked into slacks with dress shoes that were seemingly too big for him. I'd have considered him in his Sunday best if it weren't for all the stains and tears throughout his otherwise dapper outfit. The thing that made me stop, though, was that he was holding a jack-o'-lantern. Unlit and carved poorly, but he held onto it with dear life while he sat on the steps up to his front door. It wasn't extremely strange, as it was approaching the end of September. I knew that some people got into the Halloween spirit a lot sooner. There were people who started pining after fake cobwebs and skeletons when the weather finally got cold. But Timothy's family were wildly religious. If they hated the concept of fictional oddities, there was no way they celebrated All Hallows' Eve. I stopped on my bike and waved him down from the middle of the road. He didn't respond, but he looked at me so I knew he was aware of me. "I like your jack-o'-lantern, Timothy," I started happily, hoping it might pry away the wedge driven between us from our more recent encounters and the encounters of our mothers. He looked at me quizzically and pointed at the jack-o'-lantern. I nodded, and he finally spoke, kind of quiet, but I could still hear him from his porch. "My what?" he asked. I tilted my head with my eyebrows raised. "Your jack-o'-lantern. It looks really cool." His confusion didn't sway, though. He shook his head at me. "I don't know what that is. This is God." He outstretched his hands to show me he was speaking about the jack-o'-lantern. I didn't know what to say to this, but he continued so I didn't have to. "He told me to make this. He told me to give him eyes and a mouth. He wanted to be able to see me better and taste the air. I helped God see. I gave him taste." His expression was vacant, with the smallest wriggle of a smile. Those words chilled me, the feeling of frost eating away at your own blood. My gaze drifted toward the jack-o'-lantern in his hands. It was a pretty small pumpkin, with white blotches scattered throughout the mass of orange. After what he had just said, though, I felt a malevolence from it. Not as if it were possessed or some evil lingered within it. More like it was made with ill intent. That it was birthed from foulness. I wanted to leave right away, but Timothy's words came before I could. "We should all look like him, in his image," he said, a larger smile cracking beneath his sleepless eyes. "He says he'll help me make it come true." While he spoke softly, his words carried some terrifying conviction that whatever told him this was absolutely telling the truth. As a kid myself, comprehending what he was talking about was impossible. I opened my mouth to say as much, but I heard the lock on his front door open and the door itself swing wide. Timothy's mother appeared in the doorway, a large woman wearing a dirty tank top and shorts that I could even hardly see. She seethed at me and stomped her way over to Timothy, lifting him up by his shirt. This made him drop his jack-o'-lantern, and it rolled down the stairs toward me. "Boy, you better be ready to repent for conversing with that demon worshiper." "But he came over here." She didn't care. She dragged him right into their house and slammed the door shut. I immediately heard yelling from both Timothy and his mother. I got back on my bike and pretended not to hear anything. I just kept riding as if nothing happened. I never even told my parents what happened. There were 3 things that kept bothering me as I rode. One was knowing that Timothy got into a ton of trouble for just talking to me. 2 was the fact that the jack-o'-lantern had rolled to look right up at me. 3, why was the door locked if Timothy was right outside? As the weeks passed, it got closer and closer to Halloween. That added more jack-o'-lanterns and jack-o'-lantern-themed items around the school. I always loved Halloween, but funnily enough, I had no stomach for anything scary back then. Couldn't even walk down the aisles of the movie rental joints in fear of seeing Chucky staring back at me. Now, I had something else to feel weird of and be afraid about. Jack-o'-lanterns. Timothy was drawing them in class relentlessly, naming almost every picture God or him. It was often depicted as him holding a jack-o'-lantern that bore a dark, shadow-eyed stare. Others showed him holding hands with a dark figure. It looked like it was wearing a fully black cloak based on the drawing, with the head of a pumpkin, something Ichabod Crane and I were equally scared of. The addition of naming him God made that fear all the worse. From there on is when I think I stopped talking to Timothy entirely. It got too weird for me. He needed help desperately, but a 10-year-old me was not the one who could provide it. Where the other parents were as far as child protective services, I couldn't say. I never remembered it this way to begin with. My mom reminded me it got much worse, though. The days encroached on Halloween, and Timothy's drawings and speech about knowing God and meeting him increased tenfold. Their quality was dipping, though. His drawings became more like abstract sketches with spikier lines and horrible shading. His words sounded like a preacher. He wouldn't talk about anything but this God he saw and how we should all be in his image. Logan, who made the resurrection joke with me earlier, ended up approaching Timothy about it. That was when shit really hit the fan. "That's not what God looks like. That's ugly," Logan snorted. Timothy didn't respond. He kept drawing that darkened humanoid with a bright orange head. The image was getting more distorted. Even the drawing of Timothy himself was getting less shapely. He kept scratching away while Logan leered over him. Eventually, Logan pushed the drawing off Timothy's table and laughed right in his face. Probably not who I should have been spending my time with. The teacher yelled at Logan to go to the principal's office, and he left with a great pride on his face. Timothy was staring at where his drawing had been. His eyes were saucers, and I could see his lips opening and closing, like he was about to say something. It took a minute to hear what he was saying because he began virtually silent. To no one in particular, me and some other kids could hear Timothy speaking. "Look like you? He doesn't look like you. I can? Can I? I hate him. I hate him so much. He'll look like you." Logan was released at lunch, and he spun some yarn about him intimidating the principal into letting him have lunch and recess with us. I'm sure he barely got a slap on the wrist, but Logan wasn't that scary. Me, him, and other friends of ours all sat together and laughed at, I'm sure, the dumbest jokes. Probably 10 minutes in, Timothy walked over to our table to stand right beside Logan. Logan scoffed. "What's up, Timothy? You done drawing monsters, you freak?" He and a couple of others laughed while I put my head down, not wanting to get involved. "If God is ugly, you should be ugly too." Then Timothy stabbed Logan in the cheek with a pencil. It was so fast. Timothy's hand moved with an inhuman swiftness, and the teachers were on him before we even had time to react. Logan was screaming and crying through his bleeding cheek while Timothy was carried off. Before he was removed from the cafeteria, we all heard him yell, "God wants me to punish him. He works through me. He wants you to look like him." The incident was horrible enough that the rest of the students were sent home early. I told my parents about it, and they comforted me for the rest of the day. I think I forgot about it mostly, as I had pizza for dinner and was allowed just to play video games. That was the last time I ever saw Timothy. The next school day he wasn't there, or the next, or the next. Never again. My mom had told me he'd transferred, finally got out of that horrible home to a nicer family. That was what I told my fellow students subsequently. Speaking with my mother the other day, I learned the truth of what happened. I still shudder thinking about it. That conversation is forever burned into my brain. We finished our tea and I brought it up. I really hope Timothy ended up with a good family. Hope he got the help he needed too. My mother held her cup and looked at the floor, the twisting, distorted image of the carpet shining through her glass coffee table. "We lied to you," she practically whispered. Her tone was melancholy and monotone. Puzzled, I asked what she meant by that. "We lied to you about what had happened. Timothy went missing. Don't know if he was ever found." Oh God. Did his parents do something?" She shook her head, clearly rattled by the memory of it. She set her cup down as her hands began to shake. She took a few deep breaths and sighed. I couldn't fathom why she needed so much preparation for this conversation. "As you probably recall, Timothy stopped coming to school. It was about 3 or 4 days after he stopped showing up that the authorities involved themselves to investigate. They went to Timothy's house and..." She rubbed her hand over her mouth and took a moment before she continued. "What they found was hell." Apparently, when the authorities entered the unlocked door of Timothy's home, they were immediately greeted with a heinous stench. The stench of death. Upon lighting the room, they saw the walls were drenched in dried blood. They found it shaped into the images of a jack-o'-lantern. There were also messages written in it. They found the phrases, "look like him," and "in his image" throughout the entire house. When they found the bodies of Timothy's parents, they were completely exsanguinated. They were rotted and covered in flies, as any corpse might be. But the worst part was, there was a carving knife found by their bodies. The murder weapon. The instrument used to carve their eyes into triangular holes and their mouths into grins. Just like a jack-o'-lantern. I don't really know what happened to Timothy. If he was abused to the point of no return, a combination of the religious fanaticism and the awful things his parents did that just drove him to madness, or if he really heard something otherworldly speaking to him, a nightmare that posed as his god to cause him to do terrible things. I don't know where he is or what he may be doing now. All I know is that I can't look at jack-o'-lanterns anymore, now that they remind me there may be something vile beneath their toothless grins.